morning, Dr. Williams, and thank you for agreeing to talk to me again on the part 2 of our interview. This time we're going to be talking about more serious topic related to passing of George Floyd. Again, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me back, Kat. It's a pleasure to be with you again.
Thank you so much. And just a reminder, Dr. Brian Williams is Associate Professor of Trauma and Critical Care at the University of Chicago, and he's also an author, columnist. He recently contributed to Newsweek, and he is an activist in the equality, social justice matters. So Brian, I have a first question that comes to mind to me regarding George Floyd, and I think that we don't conversate enough about him as a person.
Right.
And what I'm specifically referring to is, I'm thinking, you know, he's just few years older than me when he passed away on May 25th in very tragic circumstances, which right now we now know that this was a homicide, and how much him and his family lost and humanity lost. And he was a man of multiple conflicts, in my opinion. He never finished college. I'm not sure what kind of circumstances, but there's so much more about him. His interaction with law enforcement, and then where the contradiction comes, and it just tells me how much we all have contradictions, and you can't be looking at any person at one angle, because he was also social activist and humanist in his own rights. He was working with Reformation Church. He was actually helping men from third world to start up in this country. And he had another nickname, you know, nickname he goes by is Big Floyd or Perry or Gentle Giant, the man of the 6 feet 4 inches statue. And my question to you after this longish paragraph is, how do you, as a Black man, refer to that, to this, you know, to this polarizing ideas about possibly you or all of us, and specifically, you know, being a Black man in this country and dropping from college. You finished college. Another one is, you know, you're very successful trauma surgeon. During COVID, you probably have been busier than ever. And George lost job during pandemic. He became infected with COVID-19. So there's so many different things when I think about both of you, but there is this unism also, having experience of a Black man in America.
So there are 2 things in what you just mentioned, Kasha, which I think are very important. One is that you recognize the humanity of George Floyd in his death, talking about, you know, he had a family, people that loved him. He was a man of contradictions, as you mentioned. He did some good things and some bad things. But after incidents like this occur, where a Black victim dies at the hands of police, and I like use very specific terms, like, you know, he was killed, he was murdered. Yes. The narrative generally shifts to, you know, they have a criminal record, or digging up things that paint the individual in a negative light, as if that is to wash away that they are a human being, and that, you know, we all can do good in this world. We all have flaws and contradictions. So I like that you focused on that. And then the second thing is comparing my experience to George Floyd, because that touched upon another important topic, which is how Black Americans are frequently treated as this monolithic group, as if since we're all Black, we all have the same experiences, we all think the same, and there is as much diversity in experiences and thought within the Black community as there is within any other racial or ethnic group. And for me, you know, yes, I was able to go to college. I was in the military. I was an Air Force officer at medical school. But I recognized that also I had a lot of advantages too. You know, I have privilege. So we frequently celebrate these stories of young Black kids who get 15 scholarships to every school in the nation, as if that is an anomaly. We shouldn't celebrate that. That should not be something that is unusual in this country. Uh, but you know, I came from a middle class background. I'm a military brat. My dad was in the Air Force. Uh, I got to live around the world, socialize with different cultures and different races and ethnicities, and I was put on a track to go to college. That doesn't make me better than George Floyd because he didn't go to college. I recognize that in many ways I had advantages that he didn't have because of my circumstances. So I think it's a lesson for all of us, irrespective of our race or gender or ethnicity or background, that there are opportunities that some of us have that are not given to others. And because they're unable to take advantage of those opportunities does not make them less deserving of respecting their humanity. When George Floyd was killed by a police officer in broad daylight in front of however many bystanders, he's no less human than any of the patients you and I may take care of that die from some disease. When they're gone, people still grieve.
Yes. Well, absolutely. And, you know, I think that it's something very difficult to grasp in the time of pandemic, because I think that killing of George Floyd definitely in the middle of a pandemic brings up so many inequalities to the surface. He lost the job. He was infected with COVID-19, which, as you know, there are some sections of population that are definitely at a higher risk. We're still discussing the issue of masking. And I think, you know, you and I, and probably you more than I, have this obligation to talk to people, to the audiences about proper information. So the proper scientific information gets passed on, and we give people equal opportunity to protect their families, their loved ones. And apparently, you know, this didn't happen for George. He got infected and he did well, I understand, from the infection. And this is not obviously the reason that he passed away. But, you know, I want to move on to a little bit different topic with you on the gun violence and just general violence in this country. And you know, obviously, George Floyd situation brings up a lot of issues about vulnerability of Black men. And what spoke to me specifically, your article in Newsweek, that you feel that you are going to be less of a threat if you walk in your neighborhood with your golden doodle, which, you know, this is the breed of dog that I'm absolutely in love with. So I'm very angry that you have that dog. But, you know, there's something good and wrong about that at the same time. And, you know, so we concentrate about vulnerability of men and the violence against the Black man. But I also feel that we need to talk more also about vulnerability of Black women and in the hands
Right.
of police, which has been brought up. I recently listened to the public radio in Boston, and this is also an issue that requires more light in time like that.
Right. So first of all, I will say, you know, I was a vegan for 10 years, and I'm not a fan of breeders. So our golden doodle is a somewhat of a rescue dog. There's a story behind that. So if you're a vegetarian or vegan out there, I do not want to offend you. Just let you know, I've been there, and I'll talk about the importance of the golden doodle in a second. But you know, no matter what you say, it kind of brings us back to George Floyd, right? And it's just interesting that his death shows the intersection of so many issues of inequality in our country. There is the racial disparities. There is the COVID pandemic. There is police brutality. There is criminal justice. So we could sit here and use George Floyd and his murder as a launch point for discussion of so many things, and which is instructive to us because we typically keep those issues siloed and separate, when in actuality they're interwoven. And in healthcare, we see that we talk more about the social determinants of health nowadays, and how the non-clinical issues in society actually impact one's health. And it's kind of an analogous to to that. So with George Floyd, you mentioned the COVID pandemic disparities. Black Americans represent 13% of the population in America, but they're about 25% of the COVID deaths.
Yeah.
Why is that? Black Americans, or particularly Black men, are 3 times more likely to be shot and killed by police as compared to their white counterparts. Black women are 3 times more likely to be killed by an intimate partner violence or intimate partner by gun violence than their white partners. So you see disparities in race, in gender. You mentioned the impact on Black women. So there's so much we can talk about, but if we just step back, like, what is the common thread and what can we all do to make this better? Is that just acknowledging the legacy of systemic racism and that it still exists? And by systemic racism, it doesn't mean that by us talking about it that you are racist, right? You don't have to be racist to benefit from systems that were put in place hundreds of years ago and were meant to be durable. And they were meant to exclude Black Americans and Native Americans and Brown Americans from mainstream society. And those systems still remain. And because of that, we have all these inequalities. And you mentioned the Newsweek article about the Golden Doodle. I recognize it, even though, as you mentioned, I'm a doctor. I do all these things you said I was accomplished, but I don't feel that makes me better than anyone else around me. I feel lucky and fortunate, and I recognize that I've worked hard, but I know that I'm walking around the neighborhood that people may just see there's a Black man who looks out of place, and I have already had police called on me for being a Black man out of place, at the front of my own apartment. So I know that there is that potential, and that could be lethal. So to minimize the threat I may pose to people who may not know me when they pass my neighborhood, I never go out, especially after dark, unless I'm walking my dog. Because I feel that just by having him on a leash, that makes me less threatening to those who see me. Now, whether people view me that way, I do not know, but it makes me feel better. And I've seen enough videos in the last few years and know enough stories in the past 25 years to recognize that it is a low-cost safety measure for me. It's like taking a vitamin. You take your vitamin, it may not work, but it may make you feel better.
Yes. Yeah, so that's interesting because it reminds me, that you're not only walking your neighborhood with your dog, but I'm reading more about, social connection this time of pandemic, how we all moved back to the nature and contact with our pets, which I'm sure you also recognize is so healing in the crisis like that. And there was another incident when you're talking about your experience about the Black man bird aficionado in I believe it was in Central Park, and he was called upon by another person, I think it was white woman, because she thought that he does something out of place, something potentially threatening, which obviously, we shouldn't think like that. And you're talking about the systemic problem. And I think it's very important that we recognize and pause and listen. And remember, we talked about it also last time, that one step forward is all we need to take at a time.
Right. And, it involves each of us individually acknowledging our own biases, but also the willingness to have a constructive dialogue about these issues that are historic, but also manifesting in the present. And then from that is moving towards action, towards change. And this is not going to be easy. It's not meant to be easy, but to do nothing, I really feel is not an option. And it's particularly for us in healthcare, because we are charged with providing care for strangers who come to us and expecting help. And if we allow our biases to interfere with that doctor-patient relationship, then I think we're, in essence, in violation of our oath and of our duty to serve humanity. So the work begins with us individually, and from that collectively, we can make a huge, tremendous difference. And I have these ambitious dreams of like transforming society Some may see they're not. Some may say they're grandiose. I just say that they're grand, right? And it starts with like conversations like this. We're talking about this, and then we talk to our neighbors and our friends. And then you may want to get out in the streets and march. You may want to write about it. You know, do something, but to stay in the safe, comfortable zone that many of us have been in this day and age is not an option.
Yes. And I heard something on evening news just a few days ago, because I think there's so much transformation uh, right after May 25th to where we are right now. And um, there was a very interesting sentence that we should be going from protesting right now to changing the policies, which is so important, which, I think that this is truly a next step. And a few days ago in Boston, there was a sweeping reform bill that was presented to Massachusetts Senate. And obviously it's going to be debated about the reforming police force. And one of the things that was brought up is the issue of the civil immunity of police officers. And as you know, this is the issue that is going to bring a lot of opinions. And I think this is good because it invites the dialogue. But I think what we start seeing and it's shaping is this first steps in this dialogue and policies creation. So we do have some overseeing bodies of some accountability of everything that we're doing. And as you know, in the medical field, we've been doing it, dealing with it for so long, and our actions, we are accountable for that. And how do you feel about it? I know that you were involved in police board back in Dallas. Are you still active in that? And what are your feelings about what I just mentioned?
Well, I think the first thing you said was extremely important, where we need to enact policies that are inclusive, because we are experiencing the result of policies that were put in place long ago that were meant to exclude. So to get more inclusive is not enough to just eradicate the barriers. Just moving away is not enough. We need to move towards enacting policies that move towards radical inclusivity, right? And in regards to policing, you're right. When I was in Dallas, I was the chair of the Police Review Board, which was the board that existed to hear civilian complaints about police misconduct. And there's a history of reforming that police review board during my tenure. But the things I learned from that experience that are applicable now into the question you're asking is really about people, because I was dealing with community activists, community leaders in politics, law enforcement, unions, and many people had a very different idea about what should be done with the police review board. You have your pro-police, you have anti-police, you have pro-reform, you have anti-reform. But this came down to accountability, right? It's about accountability.
Absolutely.
And it was not about punishment.
Yes.
And you really have to clarify that and just hit that over and over again. This is about accountability, and that requires transparency. Did you have public trust to improve safety? The public will not trust you without transparency and accountability. And you mentioned qualified immunity, which is really under fire right now, because this is an instrument that allows law enforcement to escape accountability for misconduct. And it had good origins. It began during Reconstruction to shield public servants from frivolous lawsuits. Say, for instance, I'm a city council person and you don't like something I voted for, you take me to court, you can do that over and over again. So qualified immunity was meant to avoid things like that, but also it protects police officers.
Yeah.
How it has evolved over time is it kind of allows law enforcement to escape accountability for any sort of misconduct, including murder. And we've seen that over and over again. There was a case a few days ago where a police officer shot a handcuffed suspect in the back and killed that person, and there's no charges, or his case was dismissed because of qualified immunity. So I agree that that needs to be looked at. You can still have qualified immunity. I mean, you can still have accountability without abusing the instruments of punishment. But the way it is now, if you are a civilian, I think I understand why it's difficult to have trust in the system that does not hold law enforcement accountable for egregious acts of misconduct, including murder.
Yeah, and as you know, I'm originally Polish, and you definitely, I see through interview and asking you this question, your heritage and understanding of all of these issues, which a lot of us, know only superficially on. But the one issue that we definitely cannot escape is listening to what's going on around the country right now, that we're dealing with so many contradictions in people's behaviors. And I just heard yesterday on NPR again on Morning Edition that 2020 is going to be the year with the largest amount of gun purchase on the record. And the percentage of first-time gun buyers is actually exceeding other, expectations and what's been recorded in the past. And what do you think about it? Because that's been analyzed, that some of it is related to COVID. The first uptake was after that, but the second one was related to the protests. So what do you think about it? Because it's really alarming, in my opinion, that this is how we react to violence with getting more guns, which in Poland, we just don't have guns. Gun is something that the police officers, army has, very controlled environment. So for me, it's very, very foreign.
Right. I mean, as a trauma surgeon, I've been dealing with gun violence for, I've lost count of how many years and the number of victims and families who have suffered from gun violence. And you are correct. Right now, I think we've already had a record number of gun sales in the last few months during the COVID pandemic. But also the data is showing that during that time, there has been an increase in intentional and unintentional firearm-related injuries and deaths.
Mm-hmm.
And the reasons for people purchasing guns are myriad. We can speculate about why that is and the pros and cons. But if we just look at the evidence, we're academics, look at the evidence and the human toll that as the purchases have gone up, the number of deaths and injuries have gone up. And that's just the victims, right? That's just the people who actually died or injured. Let's talk about the survivors. Let's talk about their family members who were not impacted. There is a psychological toll there. Think about the children who live in these communities where a lot of the gun violence is concentrated. The ripple effects of gun violence are like they're impossible to quantify. And it's constant and it goes across generations. And the fact that we're seeing this record number of gun sales, I mean, the gun sellers, I read, cannot keep up with the demand. Their shelves are empty because they're being sold so fast. So that sort of gun culture, I fear what that will mean for the safety of the American public in the present phase as far as to acute injuries, but also what it means psychologically as a country going to the future.
And in a few more minutes of our interview, I want to share with you my thoughts about recently I completed the Psychological First Aid Conference. It was a webinar that was sponsored and delivered by Massachusetts Medical Society. And it was in relation to how healthcare providers, but really is very applicable across the board, how to deal with a crisis and the pandemic. And when I'm thinking about what happened with George Floyd and how it personally affected you, I'm sure, and you talked about it, that, you went numb at the beginning, but then there's this issue of calm and realizing that this is another moment that you really need to act. It reminds me, and I wanted to hear from you what you think about that you actually are in a perfect position as a trauma surgeon, trained to deal with disaster and crisis for years. This is what you do every day. As we talked previously about, you come to work not to deal with, I have a schedule. You never know what's coming. but your response needs to be the same for everybody, you know. And how do you, so I think that you are really prepared to deal with this crisis, and actually we can learn probably from people who had so much experience with that. And you know, as a rheumatologist, I don't even remember last time when anybody talked with crisis with me, or pandemic management. So I took it very, I had a lot of anxiety at the beginning of a pandemic. But could you tell me how you dealt with it, and how uh, George Floyd's killing affected you? And do you feel that you can draw on your experiences in the crisis from what you're doing, from your trauma surgery?
Well, those are very kind words that you shared. So thank you. And you mentioned me going numb, and I think that's how when I wrote that Newsweek article about the protests, I think that was the opening line, that I was watching the protests and I went numb, and it was because these protests occurred the day after George Floyd was killed,
Yes.
and 4 years ago, the protest in Dallas occurred the day after Philando Castile was killed, and they were both, I think, they're about 5 miles apart around Minneapolis. So there was this similarity between the two events that had impacted me. And I mean, I was very concerned as I watched the protests escalating in Minneapolis about how this would go. But I also personally recognized the frustration and this need to express anger, because we weren't being listened to, right? This happened in broad daylight. This is one instance where none of the narratives in the past worked, right? You couldn't say, oh, this person was resisting arrest,
Right.
or they're running away, or they were a bad apple. It was on camera for nearly 10 minutes. Everybody saw it, and you could not use any of those sorts of explanations to sweep away what had happened. So it was tragic, and it was graphic, and you could not look away. And because of that, we can't ignore it. And it is, I think we need to somehow bring some good out of this tragedy, right? And it feels different. It feels right now that there is an energy around talking about racial justice. This has led to international protests. You and I are here having an entire discussion about this and what this means to us in healthcare, but also us as just human beings. So George Floyd's death, tragic. I feel for his family and friends who lost him prematurely. But if I can tell them, look, we're going to take this and bring some good out of this for the future. And that's how I feel that this entire incident with George Floyd can be used by me personally, just as a human being, but also as a professional going forward to continue this dialogue and push for change.
And I think there is something very tragic about, you're right, we need to stay hopeful, but I believe there's something very tragic about 2020, when there is so much related to the tragedy of breathing and lack of oxygen. And when you think about it, when you and I go to work, and when I look at my pulmonary and ICU colleagues, and they fight so tirelessly about every single person who really, a main experience with severity of COVID is lack of breath. And they spend so much of their energy, of they even sacrificing their well-being, because how long can you deal with this, function well in this crisis situation? And when I think about this really senseless loss, and it's not senseless anymore, but it's a lack of oxygen. And when you think about, when I think about my ICU colleagues, how team supports each other, and how the team of police officers was watching someone dying for 8 minutes, it brings so many tragic thoughts about similarities, but also differences. We fight for every single COVID person so they breathe, so they get out of that. And at the same time, we're looking at this at George's tragedy and tragedy of those around him. And I think, but you know, we, as you said, we need to remain hopeful and talk about it.
Right. You said lack of oxygen. It has literal and metaphorical meaning to what's going on right now. Literally, George Floyd could not breathe and died from asphyxiation. COVID and its impacts on the respiratory system, but also this is feeling just we're like suffocating under the weight of so much right now as far as the impact of the pandemic when it comes to joblessness and
Yes.
the impact on education, your kids not being able to go to school, people working from home. It just seems like a lot of weight, and sometimes you just feel like we just want to sigh and just take a deep breath, right? So there's this literal meaning and this metaphorical meaning of what it means to be unable to breathe and wanting more oxygen. And you know, I feel it. And well, you know, I also have, I don't know if you call it the benefit of being busy because gun violence is unfortunately increasing in our city in Chicago during the pandemic. We went through our phase of having a lot of COVID patients, so treating that as well. Mm-hmm. So the professional time keeps me going, but also motivated me because I recognize that what we do is really important. And I don't know, even though I'm working a lot, I feel energized by what we're doing. And it's kind of somewhat of a dichotomy to deal with all this tragedy and despair and grief, but say, okay, you know what? I'm doing what I'm meant to do. And I enjoy going to work despite doing that. When I walk in the door, it will just be 12, 18, 24 hours of human suffering during that time. But this is what we do. We're doctors. We serve humanity. So it motivates me to get out of bed every day.
Well, certainly thank you for doing it. I know that I could not be a trauma surgeon, and you know, so thank you so much for your dedication, and especially in such a challenging time right now, and wearing this mask for many hours. You know, it's also exhausting. We feel ourselves with lack of oxygen, but again, you know, comparing it to the loss of life and the future, and the way I think about George Floyd as a beautiful person, and I actually always enjoy people who have many contradictions and they coming out of that and looking how he was helping the community, other young men. That is such a positive, and I see the light at the end of a tunnel. And thank you so much for sitting down with me. I really enjoyed it, and I hope you have a good day. If you have any final thoughts?
No, thank you for having me again. And everybody stay safe, wear your mask, wash your hands, social distancing, just do your part. But and also feel free to contact me at my website, brianwilliamsmd.com. It's Brian with an I. You can find me there. It'll take you to LinkedIn and Twitter. And if you want to send me an email, I always respond. Maybe not the same day, but I will get back to you. brianwilliamsmd.com. Thank you again.
Thank you again so much for talking to me. Have a nice day, Brian.
Thank you very much. Stay